Narayana Gurukula, Webinar 5, General Philosophy, on the 5th of April 2021. What is the scientific method? Where do philosophy and science differ? How do we claim Vedanta is scientific? Today, the session is actually on where do philosophy and science differ based on the pre-recording on what is the scientific method. On that introduction, let us go to our second topic of the series. Here today talking to you is Dr. Jason Suresh, Senior House Officer in Orthopedics, St. Richard's Hospital, Chichester, UK. Let us begin. Let's discuss the two disciplines, science and philosophy. Science is systematic or accurate as understood by the five senses. Philosophy, on the other hand, has thoughts and similar hypotheses but perceived beyond our senses. Science tests a hypothesis and draws a theory or principle. Philosophy, on the other hand, needs to be experienced, and there is no single way it works. Science deals with a lot of outer engineering and is quite expensive when it comes to it. However, philosophy, on the other hand, does a lot of inner engineering and is relatively free of cost. Question. I keep 6 honest serving men, they taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when, and how and where and who. The poem The Elephant's Child by Rudyard Kipling. The 6 questions depict curiosity, and every discipline is in search of an answer to these questions. Let us explore more. There is a lot of brainstorming in common when it comes to science and philosophy. The Big Bang Theory, the origin of the universe, where did we come from and where do we go? Theories about the origin of the universe and the origin of life. We have already seen them, haven't we? The existence of extraterrestrial beings. Are we alone in this universe? The initial knowledge of a newborn, the primitive reflexes, the first cry, the suckling reflex, or like the baby deer, when you look at the picture, who's just learning to make its first step to learn walking. Another interesting thing is about time travel and the duality or the dual nature of matter. Can we travel as waveforms from one point to the other? That's an interesting thought for both the scientist and the philosopher. What is consciousness and what is the purpose of life? And what is enlightenment and how to get there to experience it? Let's just review the brainstorming questions in common. As a recap, what is the basis of our existence? What is consciousness and self-realization? Where are we? Possibility of time travel. Are we alone in this universe? Where do life come from? Where does it go to? Where does the mind or soul exist? Why or how or when did happen the Big Bang? How does a newborn has its reflexes for survival? Who, if so, governs the forces in this universe? These are some of these common questions involved in the brainstorming with both science and philosophy. Let's try and look at the scientist's perspective. Here is our little scientist who's breaking his brains to try and understand things. He has his pro forma with experiment, observation, and inference, which is how he tries to understand concepts. And he's quite rationalistic in his approach, that, if anything that doesn't really fit these observation, inference, and the experiment, it's not something that he would consider rational. Questions by the scientist to philosophy, or to the philosopher. Why is there no demonstrable experiment, observation, or inference in what you say? And what is the theory of everything? This is something which is very interesting to science, the theory of everything. This book, written by Stephen Hawking, is where he contemplates and tries to explore the origin and fate of the universe, and he mentions the so-called unexplainable as perhaps God. Interesting, isn't it? Now let's look at the philosopher's angle of thoughts. Here we have Socrates, the philosopher, sitting in a chair in his thoughtful state. He's thinking and constantly weighing good versus bad. What values make you think of contrasts? Heaven and hell, angels and demons, good or bad, peace and war. And why does the good things make you feel good? There are some of the things the philosopher has in mind. Constantly, he thinks about what is right and what is wrong, and also about the spirits, as to whether it is good or evil. He tries to find out the differences and find an answer to what is that particular thing within him that helps him appreciate the good and to stay good. Let's look at some of the questions by the philosopher to the scientist, or science in general. To the philosopher, pure knowledge is as clear as crystal. So what is pure knowledge? Is a question. To science, how should we conduct ourselves? And another interesting piece is, how can you prove you're awake at this very moment, as are the others? It poses a question to science, suggesting the wakeful states and its relativeness to people. Let's now try and explore some of the differences between science and philosophy. Existence of Andhakaranam, Manasa, Chittam, Buddhi, Ahangaram. Where does it all exist? I think we should discuss about the Taittiriya Upanishad in this context to reveal the layers to the self, or the Panchakoshas. Taittiriya Upanishad has three sections. The first section, the Shikshavalli, elaborates Brahman as Satyam, Jnanam, and Anantam, which means reality, knowledge, and infinity. However, in Brahmanandavalli, we see more about the Panchakoshas, or the five layers to the self. Let us elaborate on this. The outermost one is the Annamaya Kosha, which is formed from food. The second one is the Pranamaya Kosha, which is the vital energy sheath, which nourishes the Annamaya Kosha and is the essence of uh, living being. Or, in another word, we can say that it is what nourishes the outer layer. The third one, or the Manomaya Kosha, is about mind and emotions. When we go to the Vijnanamaya Kosha, it is about wisdom and intellect. And finally, the Anandamaya Kosha is the innermost, where you experience eternal bliss. Thus, trying to explain many intangible entities unexplained by science, we can see the four parts of Andhakarana in the Manomaya Kosha and the Vijnanamaya Kosha scattered across. This gives us room to explore more on where we come from, where do we go, and also about the five elements. Let us now go through this exercise about the deer with an apple in its mouth. When you look at this picture, I would describe this as a deer with an apple in its mouth. However, there can be different thoughts to different people. Some may think it is cute and pleasing to the eyes, but if you look at it in a different angle, on the other side, the same information may be relayed in a different way. In short, attitude is very important. Let's now try and understand the perception of thought. Let's try and take another example for perception of thought. We have a knife here probably giving a nerve tick to my viewers. However, let's see how it can be interpreted by different people in different ways. It can be seen as being used by the mother goddess to ward off evil and trying to protect her child. On the other hand, you can also see Devi Annapurna, who is the mother goddess who tries to feed their children. And this is probably she might be using the knife to chop some vegetables or preparing some food. Well, if we look at it in another angle, this could be me. I'm a doctor by profession, working in surgery. So probably the knife is still being used to save lives. Or like probably, as many of you would have already thought, this could have been a way or a means to cause harm. In essence, the same knife can be perceived in different ways, being used to protect or ward off evil by Mahakali, to preserve, as in the case with Annapurna, or for the surgeon to save lives, or for the slayer. Let's now speak more about the origin of life. This is the Urey and Miller experiments. Let's try and explain this a little bit. This was a replica of the primitive atmosphere being made in a laboratory setting. Essentially, what they did was to take a glass apparatus, which is known as the Urey-Miller flask, in which they took water and they were boiling the water so that it turns out to water vapor. So you had water vapor and the primitive gases that existed, which was devoid of oxygen, which was methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. And used to have these electrodes that go into this flask through which sparks were generated, which would resemble lightning, like in the primitive atmosphere. So you have the gases, water coming as water vapor, and the sparks of electricity coming as lightning, which would precipitate down to form the initial molecules, or the biomolecules, which are the fundamental principles that are involved in sustenance of life. So the Urey-Miller experiment goes as this. Under primitive earth conditions, the primitive soup consisting of coarsevates or primitive evidence of life was demonstrated. Let's now compare it with this different perspective and try and understand it a bit more in detail. Relating to the Panchabhutas, we have earth, water, fire, air, and ether. When we try and relate the Urey-Miller experiment to the Panchabhutas, we can consider the flask as earth. The space inside the flask or the vacuum becomes ether. And about air, because it is the primitive atmosphere, it had only methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, and no oxygen. So air within the apparatus became methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, and fire is essentially being represented by the electric sparks coming through the electrodes resembling lightning. Water, as water vapor, being boiled here, is also present, and that led to the formation of the coacervates, or the primitive soup, as has been already explained. Doesn't this seem that it is the same thing being explained in a different way? It's worth thinking about it. Essentially, it is the same thing explained in a different way. Now this will lead to our big question. Let's try and get into it. This is the Virat Purusha, the cosmic energy, according to Hinduism. The origin of the universe and life can be traced to the Purusha Sukta. Verses 13 and 14 of Purusha Sukta are as given here. It goes this way. Chandrama manaso jataha chaksho suryo ajayata mukhadindraschagnischa pranadvayurajayata nabhya asidantarikshamशीर्ष्णोऽध्यौ समवर्तत पद्भ्यां भूमिर्दिशश्रोत्रात् तथा लोका kalpayan. Which means that the origin of entities like the moon came from the manas, sun from the eyes, Indra and Agni from the mouth, Vayu from breath, Antariksham from his navel, and his head sustained heaven, and the feet sustained earth, ears the directions, and thus all worlds were regulated by him. According to different mythology, as per the Bible and the Genesis, it goes this way about the first man on earth, Adam. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. However, though we have all these information in different contexts, the question still remains, what is the purpose of life? Isn't it? Let's try to understand it in a different way. Where can we find the equilibrium? This is an interesting question. Science does the outer engineering in depth by looking deeper into a problem statement. Philosophy does an inner engineering to experience a solution to a problem. Where is the equilibrium? And why should we be worried? Is it because humans are civilized? What about animals? The perfect blend of both the disciplines will be an amazing experience, and everything will fall in place. What happens when there is an imbalance? We don't know. Would science be able to explain what philosophy tries to convey? These are interesting questions to which we may have an answer, we may not have an answer, but it still is a grey area. Let's talk a little bit of chemistry and try to understand it in a scientific way. The equilibrium. This gentleman here, Henry Louis Le Chatelier, is well known for his Le Chatelier's principle, which goes this way. So Le Chatelier's principle states that whenever A system is in dynamic equilibrium when any of the factors affecting the equilibrium are altered. The system will readjust in such a way as to nullify the effect of the change. Which means, if you look here at a happy system and it has a stress factor coming there, the variables will readjust in such a way that the happy system stays happy all the time. In short, the equilibrium is always maintained in spite of all efforts that are put in. Which takes us to a different concept of the art of getting lost. Just like the Mobius band. Because the more you get involved, the more complicated it gets. And you get lost, confused, unsure, unclear, perplexed, disoriented, bewildered, just like you are in a maze. And the more you get in, the more confusing it gets until you attain moksha through the principles which are entailed in philosophy. Now, we discussed about civilization and how civilized people can be. When it comes to animals, it's a different angle, but it's different from a man's angle. You may choose to be the animal in equilibrium or the man following your discipline. The choice is unto you. On that note, let me conclude. Thank you.